Chris, come stand up for me. Oh, forget it. Just pick it up. Girls are still in the truck.
Did they ask you what you were doing, taking mommy out, or?
Yeah, I don't remember what I told them, but they did ask.
They say specifically.
It was more like, what are you doing to mommy?
Then the girls are.
Picture this. It's a warm August morning in Frederick, Colorado, a small, idyllic town where neighbors wave as they pass. Children's laughter echoes from well-kept yards, and the sun rises gently over quiet suburban streets, lined with identical houses. To anyone driving through this pristine neighborhood, the Watts family home was the picture of middle-class perfection. Christopher Lee Watts, a 33-year-old oil field operator with a soft smile and an easygoing demeanor, lived here with his 34-year-old wife, Shanann, and their two daughters, Bella, 4, and Celeste, just 3 years old. Shanann, a vibrant and determined woman, was deeply loved by her friends and family. Her social media pages overflowed with photos of family trips, birthday parties, and sweet videos of Chris playing with the girls. She was also 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, a baby boy they had already named Nico. Their life, at least online, looked perfect. Chris was the quiet, devoted father. Shanann was a dedicated mom and successful businesswoman who adored her family. But what you're about to hear isn't just another tragic story of domestic violence. It's a chilling descent into the mind of a man who hid monstrous darkness behind the mask of a loving husband. A man who smiled for family photos, even as he plotted the unimaginable. On the morning of August 13, 2018, Shanann returned home from a business trip at 1:48 a.m. Her friend, Nicole Atkinson, had dropped her off after a late flight and noticed Shanann seemed tired, but in good spirits. That morning, when Nicole couldn't reach Shanann for a doctor's appointment, her concern quickly escalated. She called Chris, who was supposedly at work, and then drove to the Watts house. When Chris arrived, he appeared calm, even detached, as Nicole and police officers searched for any sign of Shanann or the girls. Shanann's purse, phone, and wedding ring were all in the house, but there was no trace of her or the children. The scene was eerie. A tidy home, no sign of a struggle, yet an overwhelming sense of wrongness. Chris played the role of the worried husband well enough for a few hours, appearing on local television with a tearless plea for his family's return. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, if you're out there, just come back. If someone has them, just bring them back. I need to see everybody again. This house is not complete without anybody here, he said, his voice oddly flat, his demeanor stiff. It was a performance, one that would soon crumble under scrutiny. Detectives were already suspicious. Chris's story didn't add up. He claimed they'd had an emotional conversation about separating, and when he left for work early that morning, everything was fine. But why would Shanann leave her car, her phone, and her medication behind? Why would she vanish without a trace, with 2 small children in tow? And why did Chris seem so composed? Meanwhile, the community rallied, holding vigils, sharing flyers, and expressing shock that something like this could happen in their quiet town. Friends described Shanann as devoted and doting, always posting videos of her daughters singing songs and laughing. Chris was quiet but affectionate, appearing like the perfect partner. But beneath that image was a marriage that had been quietly crumbling. Shanann, ever candid on social media, had posted about marital struggles, health challenges, and her efforts to save their relationship. She was working tirelessly while pregnant, often traveling for her job, and had confided in friends that she feared Chris was pulling away. The truth was far darker than she could have imagined. While Shanann was focused on her family, Chris had started an affair with a co-worker, Nicole Kessinger, a woman who believed he was separated and on the verge of divorce. The affair was passionate, intoxicating, and it gave Chris a glimpse of a different life, a life free of responsibility, one where he could reinvent himself. But instead of seeking an honest separation, Chris was weaving a deadly plan. The contrast between his outward appearance and his hidden intentions would soon shock the entire world. Detectives, growing increasingly suspicious, brought Chris in for questioning on August 15th. They had already noticed his strange behavior, his lack of urgency, his calmness, his inconsistent answers. As he sat in the interrogation room, Chris clung to his story, insisting he had no idea where his family was. But investigators had a powerful tool at their disposal, a neighbor's surveillance camera. The footage showed Chris backing his truck into the garage early that morning, loading something large and heavy before leaving for work. The video contradicted his claims, and the walls were beginning to close in. Adding to the tension was the gut instinct of the neighbor who owned the footage. He told police Chris was acting strangely, unlike his usual quiet self. With mounting evidence and suspicions, investigators asked Chris to take a polygraph test. Chris agreed, believing he could charm his way out of trouble. But his calm facade began to crack. After he failed the test, detectives pressed him harder, urging him to tell the truth. Chris finally confessed, but not to the full extent of his crimes. In a calculated move to shift blame, he claimed that he had strangled Shanann only after she killed their daughters in a fit of rage. It was a shocking and manipulative lie, one meant to save himself from ultimate condemnation. Investigators, however, weren't convinced. The pieces didn't fit. Shanann had been nurturing and protective, deeply devoted to her daughters, and her autopsy would later confirm she was strangled while carrying baby Nick. Chris's story was unraveling, and the real horror was about to come to light. As detectives dug deeper, Chris finally admitted the unthinkable. He had murdered Shanann in their bed after an argument about separating. He strangled her as she pleaded for her life, then wrapped her body in a sheet and dragged her downstairs. In the same house, while their mother lay lifeless, Bella and Celeste were awake, terrified, and confused. Chris loaded their mother's body into his work truck, placed his two daughters in the back seat, and drove them to an isolated oil site owned by his company. What happened next would shock even the most hardened investigators. At the remote site, Chris smothered his daughters one by one, murdering them as they clutched their blankets, still trusting their father, even as he betrayed them in the worst way imaginable. Bella, the eldest, fought back, pleading, "Daddy, no." Her final words forever etched into the memory of those who heard his confession. Chris then disposed of their tiny bodies by pushing them into separate oil tanks, their small frames fitting through hatches barely 8 inches wide. Shanann's body was buried in a shallow grave nearby, her unborn son Nico never to take his first breath. The sheer coldness of these acts stunned detectives. Chris's methodical approach, his ability to carry out these killings and return home to clean the house and text his mistress, revealed a chilling detachment from reality. When news broke of his confession and the grim discovery of their bodies, the entire nation recoiled. The Watts family, once a symbol of suburban happiness, became synonymous with betrayal and evil. But this was only the beginning of the investigation. Over the coming months, chilling details would emerge. The text messages between Chris and Nicole Kessinger, his internet searches about how to have a fresh start, and his eye calm in media interviews, even as he knew his family lay dead miles away. Shanann's friends and family were devastated, struggling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster he truly was. This case was more than a tragedy. It was a study in deception, a reminder of how darkness can hide in plain sight. The Watts home, once filled with laughter and love, became a crime scene that symbolized betrayal on every level. And as the trial loomed, the world would soon hear every gruesome detail of how one man destroyed his entire family for the illusion of a new life. From the moment Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were reported missing, law enforcement sensed something was deeply wrong. And as the investigation unfolded, the mask Christopher Watts had carefully worn began to crack under the pressure of relentless scrutiny. The Frederick Police Department, with assistance from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, and the FBI, worked tirelessly, combing through surveillance footage, phone records, and interviews with friends and neighbors, all of which painted a hauntingly inconsistent picture of Chris's supposed desperation to find his family. While his television plea for their safe return played on news stations across the nation, investigators already had a sense that they were dealing with a man capable of horrific deception. Chris had volunteered for a polygraph test, which he failed spectacularly. And during the interrogation that followed, the chilling facade of the soft-spoken father began to crumble. The detectives skillfully picked apart his alibi, focusing on his body language, his detached tone, and his contradictions, until Chris broke under the weight of evidence and revealed a version of the truth, but not the full truth. At first, he spun a cruel narrative that Shanann had strangled their daughters, and he had killed her in a fit of anger, a desperate attempt to salvage some semblance of sympathy. But investigators were already piecing together the timeline of that morning. Security footage from his neighbor's home showed him backing his work truck into the garage, meticulously loading something large, while his demeanor during a police walkthrough was calm, almost eerily so. His co-workers recalled his unusual behavior that morning at the oil site, and forensic evidence would soon prove Shanann never harmed her children. Chris was lying to protect himself. The psychological games he played with detectives only added to the disturbing portrait of a man who had detached entirely from reality, prioritizing his image and future over the lives of his family. The truth was revealed in shocking detail over time. Chris admitted to strangling Shanann after an argument where she confronted him about wanting a divorce and suspected infidelity. What makes this crime particularly chilling is not just the act itself, but the cold calculation behind it. After ending his wife's life, Chris calmly wrapped her body in a sheet, carried her down the stairs, and loaded her into his truck while Bella and Celeste, still alive, followed him, confused and frightened. He then drove to a remote oil site where he worked, bringing along his 2 daughters, who sat quietly in the back seat beside their dead mother. In later confessions, Chris revealed the haunting details of Bella's last words. "Daddy, no!" She fought him, biting her tongue and lips in terror as he smothered her, while Celeste clutched her favorite blanket, trusting him to the end. He placed each of their small bodies in separate oil tanks, leaving Shanann in a shallow grave nearby. The sheer coldness of this crime stunned investigators, who described the level of premeditation and emotional detachment as among the most disturbing they'd ever seen. Chris then went about his day, texting his mistress, Nicole Kessinger, pretending everything was normal, while the bodies of his family were hidden at the oil site. The investigation into Chris's affair revealed a critical motive. Nicole, who was initially unaware of Shanann's pregnancy, believed Chris was separated and preparing for divorce. Their relationship was passionate and intense, and Chris was infatuated with the idea of starting a new life with her. Police uncovered chilling internet searches from Nicole's phone about marrying your mistress, and Chris's own searches about how to start a new life and the value of a child's life insurance payout. Nicole would later cooperate fully with authorities, expressing shock and horror over the murders. This affair, while not making her complicit, painted a picture of Chris as a man willing to annihilate his family, for a fantasy future. Shanann's close friends, who had grown increasingly concerned about Chris's distant behavior and Shanann's emotional struggles, provided heartbreaking insight into her final days. Shanann had confided in friends that Chris seemed cold, uninterested in their marriage, and evasive about their baby boy, Nico. She returned from a business trip just hours before her murder, tired but determined to repair their marriage. Friends noted that Shanann had been excited about her pregnancy and had a doctor's appointment scheduled for that day. The fact that Chris killed her that very morning, while their children were present, underscored the calculated nature of his actions. Meanwhile, the case gripped the nation, with the media airing Chris's initial pleas for their safe return alongside breaking updates that he had been arrested. The contrast between his calm demeanor in interviews and the horrifying truth stunned viewers. Chris became a symbol of hidden evil, a man who seemed gentle and family-oriented, but was capable of unfathomable cruelty. Detectives continued building their case with damning evidence. Forensic analysis confirmed Shanann had been strangled, and her unborn child, Nico, had died from lack of oxygen. Autopsies of Bella and Celeste revealed the brutality of their deaths, with Bella showing injuries consistent with fighting back against her father. The oil tanks, where their bodies were found, were so narrow that investigators had to cut them open to recover the girls, a harrowing task that left seasoned professionals shaken. The recovery of their bodies was not just logistically challenging, but emotionally devastating. Photos of the small tanks and grave were later released in court documents, leaving the public horrified by the level of planning involved in disposing of his own daughters. Chris's arrest shattered the illusion of the perfect family that Shanann had lovingly portrayed online. Her social media, filled with heartfelt posts about her love for Chris and their girls, now became haunting artifacts of a life that Chris had secretly resented. Prosecutors would later argue that Chris had meticulously planned the murders, choosing a work site far enough away to buy time before anyone realized his family was missing. They painted a picture of a man consumed by selfishness and infatuation, willing to destroy his family for a relationship built on lies. During his time in jail, Chris initially maintained his story about Shanann killing the girls. But as evidence mounted and public outrage grew, he pleaded guilty in November 2018 to 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased body. The plea deal spared him the death penalty, but it also solidified him as one of the most reviled figures in recent true crime history. At his sentencing hearing, prosecutors revealed more gruesome details, and Shanann's family gave emotional victim impact statements that brought many in the courtroom to tears. Shanann's father, Frank Rzucek, spoke through sobs, saying, "You heartless monster. I trusted you to take care of them, not kill them." Shanann's mother, Sandra, expressed her heartbreak over losing her daughter and granddaughters in such a brutal way. Chris sat silently, showing little emotion as he listened to their words. Judge Marcelo Kopkow condemned him for his most inhumane and vicious acts, sentencing him to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy and the disposal of the bodies. Even as he was sentenced, Chris's lack of visible remorse baffled many. It wasn't until months later, during a chilling prison interview, that Chris finally confessed in full detail, recounting the murders step by step in a detached manner that left investigators stunned. He admitted that Bella had walked in after he killed Shanann, asking if her mother was okay, and that both girls had been alive when he loaded them into his truck. His confession about Bella's final words, "Daddy, no," was one of the most haunting revelations of the entire case. These details painted Chris not just as a murderer, but as a cold-blooded predator who betrayed the very people who trusted him most. The Watts family murders became a symbol of hidden domestic danger, a reminder that evil often wears a mask of normalcy. The case inspired documentaries, including Netflix's American Murder, The Family Next Door, which used Shanann's own social media videos, police body cam footage, and interrogation recordings to give viewers a chillingly intimate view of the crime. The documentary became one of Netflix's most watched true crime films, drawing global attention to the tragedy. Even now, years later, the case remains one of the most shocking family annihilation stories in history, in part because of the stark contrast between the loving family image Shanann worked so hard to create and the horrific betrayal by her husband. Chris Watts now spends his life in a Wisconsin prison, serving out his sentences in isolation due to the danger posed by other inmates. Nicole Kessinger disappeared from public view after receiving death threats, and Shanann's family has devoted their lives to honoring her memory, often speaking out about the importance of recognizing the warning signs of domestic violence and coercive control. The Watts' Colorado home, once a family's safe haven, became an eerie monument to betrayal, eventually selling at auction after sitting empty for years. This story continues to resonate because it highlights not just the brutality of the crime, but the fragility of appearances. Beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives, darkness can fester undetected until it explodes in unimaginable violence. The aftermath of the Watts family murders left a deep scar on the small community of Frederick, Colorado, and resonated far beyond its borders, becoming a global cautionary tale of how evil can exist behind the most polished facades. For Shanann's family, grief was compounded by betrayal, as they had loved Chris as their own, and never suspected that their daughter's husband could be capable of such unimaginable cruelty. They not only lost Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and unborn baby Nico, but were also left grappling with the knowledge that Chris's actions had been deliberate and calculated. The public, too, struggled to reconcile the image of the quiet, seemingly devoted father seen in Shanann's social media videos with the cold-blooded killer revealed in court. In the months following Chris's confession, the story dominated headlines and became the subject of countless podcasts, documentaries, and social media discussions. Netflix's American Murder. The Family Next Door brought an unprecedented level of intimacy to the case, using Shanann's own videos and texts to tell her story in her own voice, and it left viewers worldwide stunned by how seamlessly a family annihilator could conceal darkness behind everyday normalcy. The documentary highlighted the insidious nature of coercive control. Chris's emotional withdrawal, his secret affair, and his growing resentment of his family were not sudden developments, but warning signs that Shanann had sensed, confiding in friends about his distant behavior shortly before her death. The chilling detail that he killed Shanann while she was 15 weeks pregnant and then drove his two daughters to their deaths, listening to them cry for their mother, solidified this case as one of the most disturbing examples of intimate partner homicide in modern times. Psychologists analyzing the case have described Chris's actions as those of a man. Psychologists analyzing the case have described Chris's actions as those of a man consumed by narcissism, fantasy, and emotional detachment, traits often seen in family annihilators who destroy their families rather than face personal failure or loss of control. For Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Razuchek, their mission became not only to grieve, but also to advocate, speaking out about the importance of paying attention to red flags in relationships and the need for more conversations about domestic abuse that isn't always physical, but emotional, manipulative, and controlling. They have worked tirelessly to preserve Shanann and her daughter's legacy, sharing memories of their joyful spirits and resilience, and reminding the world that behind the sensational headlines were 3 innocent lives and 1 unborn child robbed of a future. Meanwhile, Chris Watts remains imprisoned for life, reportedly living in isolation for his own safety, as other inmates see his crimes as particularly heinous. He is said to spend most of his time reading the Bible, and though he has made occasional statements expressing remorse, many doubt the sincerity of his words given the cold, calculated nature of his actions. His mistress, Nicole Kessinger, who cooperated with investigators and had no prior knowledge of his intentions, has lived in hiding due to public outrage, a reminder of how far-reaching the consequences of Chris's actions have been for everyone involved. Even the Watts family home, once filled with laughter and memories, became a chilling landmark, eventually sold at auction, forever tainted by tragedy. The Watts case also became a study in modern true crime media, as it was one of the first high-profile murder investigations to be documented almost entirely through body cam footage, social media posts, and text messages, offering a raw, unfiltered look into Shanann's life and